Hey, everybody. We're going to jump right into chapter 4, which is biomechanics. So let me share my screen. Again, up to this point, a lot of the beginning components of this book and of this exam, there is a lot of science-based side to it. So that's why we're not talking about like workouts yet or exercises or programming or that type of thing. We kind of have to get the scientific foundations down before we move into everything else. And so hopefully you don't feel too overwhelmed or anything like that. Again, hopefully you're asking questions, figuring things out the best you can, working with each other, reading your textbook. That's going to help a lot. So again, the big nuts and bolts are kind of what I'm bringing in into this chapter. So again, some terminology that we'll go through. So linear motion, so that's moving in a straight line or a curved path. So think forward and backwards is an easy way. Angular motion, body rotates on an axis. So think like, right, an angle. And then we're going to look at the planes of movement. So there's the frontal plane, the sagittal plane, and the transverse plane. Now, most of our movements occur, and you'll see this in the sagittal plane. It's the frontal and the transverse that we don't train a lot in. And so for you guys, just a little pitch into if you become personal trainers and you want to introduce new exercises, things that are frontal or transverse exercises tend to surprise the clients a little bit. They have a little more fun with them. They're a little more challenging. They might leave them sore and things like that. So just a little nugget for you guys there. Kinematics is the study of movement without regards to forces. So we're not worried about the force. Kinetics is movement assessment with respect to involved forces. So basically one is just without talking about forces. One is force is a factor. So again, just some general definitions. Hopefully you understand those kind of as we go forward. So here's kind of that picture. Let me move this out of the way as best we can. So you have your planes of movement. So the sagittal plane is this plane right here that splits the person into left and right sides. And so if you think about movements that we do, right, if you're running, so if I'm running, right, my arms are moving, I'm moving in the sagittal plane, right? I'm moving on either side, the left or the right side of the body, right? My legs are doing the same thing, right? So left side, right side. Then you have the frontal plane, which splits you actually into front and then rear, or anterior and posterior. Okay. And so those movements, even though you would think front and back would mean front and back movements, it actually means side to side. So if you think like a lateral squat where you step out to the side and then come back, or when you make a cut and then you move, that is a frontal plane movement because you're moving in that space. And then transverse, think about cutting the body in half and you're rotating off of that split, right? So a lot of times we talk about the hips. If you've thrown a baseball, thrown a football, if you golfed, anything like that, right? The hips and that rotation, that is a transverse movement. So most of our movements fall somewhere in a mixture of those things, right? It might be more sagittal, might be a little frontal, might have some rotation, and some are strictly just sagittal or just frontal or just transverse. And so exercises are really going to kind of fall into one of these three or a combination of these three planes of movement. So when you're writing a program, you may want to, include some sagittal movements, some frontal movements, and some transverse movements. So making sure the body moves in each of its planes of motion. Here are a bunch of different motions. So you can see, and it'll tell you what they are. So we can look at the wrist in sagittal, elbow in the sagittal. So again, moving out and upward, this second picture over here, right? Then you have the shoulder in the frontal plane. So this up and to the side, right? This is in that frontal plane that we were just talking about. Then you have the shoulder in the transverse. So if I come here and I come out to the side, right? It's that rotation. I'm coming off of that transverse plane, right? And so you have a bunch of different options here. And just so use the pictures to hopefully explain kind of where the movements are coming from. Let's talk about force for a second. So the definition of force, a mechanical action or effect applied to a body that tends to produce acceleration. Okay. So you can think about this in two ways with the body. You can think about it internally. So what's inside of us? Muscle, tendons, ligaments. We can create a lot of internal force, right? If you were just sitting there right now and you squeezed as tight as you could, right, you would be creating internal force, right? You're generating force from inside of your body. External force would be something like gravity, friction, a barbell on your back, right? Or holding a dumbbell. That is external force that you need to overcome if the movement is going to happen. So again, just understand there's internal and then there's external. How that's measured, I'm not sure how much you'll need to know this calculation wise, but if you've taken physics or anything like that, they use newtons. So Newton is force in pounds. So 1 pound equals about 4.45 newtons. So if you're going to do some calculations, I don't think you'll need to do that for the exam or ever when you're programming. Just know that the goal here is to generate force in some way. Some force related factors: magnitude, location, direction, duration, frequency, variability, and rate. Again, things to look at, and your book goes into them a little bit more in detail. But just be aware of force is the name of the game. And we're going to look at how we overcome that force, or how, and the different ways our bodies do that. Newton's laws of motion. They do talk about these in the book, and so I think it's important to touch on them. There's a link here. So not in this video, but if you go to the PowerPoint that I've also uploaded or shared with you guys, that's a simplified video that you guys can watch. Actually, you know what? We'll probably just watch it now, but I'll talk about them first. So first, a body at rest or in motion tends to remain at rest or in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. So it's going to stay at rest unless something acts on it. A net force acting on a body produces an acceleration proportional to the force according to the equation. This would just be the sum of all forces. That's the F equals mass times acceleration. So that's how you calculate force, is mass and acceleration. And then for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. We've used that a lot in life, just in general, right? You put something in, you're going to get something equal on the way out. Okay. And here, let's go. Hopefully this will open. You guys can watch it. After this ad.
Welcome to Moo Math and Science. In this video, I'd like to talk about Newton's 3 laws of motion. Sir Isaac Newton lived in the 1600s and developed 3 laws to describe all states of motion. Law number 1, or also called the law of inertia, states that matter wants to resist any change in motion. If an object is at rest, it wants to stay at rest. If an object is in motion, it wants to stay in motion. Also, the more massive an object, the greater its inertia. These dominoes will stay at rest forever unless an outside force acts on it, like this push from someone's hand. Also, this player punts the ball. Due to inertia, what does the ball want to keep doing? Stay in motion. But why doesn't? Because outside forces like air friction and gravity act on it. Why is this car hard to push? That is because it wants to stay at rest and it has a larger mass than the man trying to push it. Law 2 states that the acceleration of an object depends on the force acting on it and the mass of the object. There's also an equation to go along with this law, and it states that force equals mass multiplied by acceleration. Look at this golf swing. The golf club has a high rate of acceleration and strikes the golf ball with great force. This hammer has a greater mass and acceleration than the piggy bank, and look what happens. And finally, law 3 states that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Look closely at this jellyfish swimming. As the jellyfish moves its body backward, it actually moves forward because the water exerts a force in the opposite direction, which causes the jellyfish to move forward. Same with this skateboard. The foot is pushing the skateboard backwards, but the skateboard is going forward. That is because the foot and the pavement is exerting a force in the opposite direction, causing it to go forward when pushing backwards. So there we go, Newton's 3 laws of motion.
Yeah, so hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Again, thinking about just using some real life examples and overcoming force and things like that. Some lever systems. So levers, not to be confusing, just there are different classes is what we call them, and how there's an interaction between forces. And there's another video, which I think is really helpful. It was helpful for me when I was in college trying to learn them. And so the fulcrum, think about it as kind of the balance. If you think about a seesaw, The fulcrum is in the middle. And so that's when the fulcrum is between two forces. And when we watch the video, essentially it's going to be your muscles are trying to generate force against an external force. So think like a dumbbell or something like that. So those are the two forces that we're battling. And depending on the joint angle or the joint system, the lever is going to determine kind of how we do it or if we're successful or not. The second class is resistance force. So we call that FR, is located between the fulcrum and the applied force. So you'll see basically the fulcrum, so that point, then the resistance force, and then the applied force. And again, so the seesaw has shifted a little bit. And then you have a third class where the FA, the applied force, is between the fulcrum and FR. So this time you'd have fulcrum, FA, and then FR. Most of our body's joints are third class levers, and you'll see that in a second. And I'll try to explain the video as well. Mechanical advantage. So how mechanically advantage, the height of the mechanical advantage is looking at the resistance force compared to the applied force. The longer the moment arm, and you'll see moment arm is just the distance, wins. And you'll see that again in a second. First class, second class, and third class. Oops, sorry about that. So again, we have our 3 classes, and they'll give you examples of each of them. So again, this is our seesaw. So if you look at this picture, so you have the seesaw in the middle, right, that we looked at, and then your body is going to be like this. So the point of movement, right? So if I turn sideways, that movement, okay, is your fulcrum. So your balance where you're moving. Your resistance is gravity, right? Pushing downward. And you're fighting that, and then you're applying that force to pull your chin downward, right? So you've been standing upright, the force is applied as you go, but the muscles that do that are back here. So they are in between that balance point as we go. Does that kind of make sense? So that's your first class lever. So looking for those arrows in that balance. And again, sorry, I might have said that wrong. Pulling your head back is going to be the force, right? So this shortens, and that's what brings your head back up and facing forward. So that's where your force is coming from. So now it's between, the load is between the fulcrum. This one's a little harder, and we don't have a lot of class 2 levers in our body, but you can see, so again, the point of movement, if we're going to try to get onto our toes, so that's the joint that we're going to be moving on. The resistance is our body, right? Gravity pushing us downward, and we're trying to fight that by going up on our toes. And what does that is the muscle on this side, and it's attached back here, right? So you can see how it matches the scale right there. Right. So again, slightly different. First one, we had resistance on both sides. This one, we have the resistant force on the same side as the action force. Here's one where we bend our arm, and you'll see how they write it all out. Right, so your elbow joint is the movement spot, so that's your fulcrum. The resistance would be your hand, right? Or the weight in your hand. You think about a bicep curl, right? So the resistance is here. And then your active force, right, is in between. Because if you actually look where it's attached, even though the bicep is above the elbow, but where is it attached? It's attached down here, which is in front of the elbow joint. And so that's where that pull comes from. Okay. So that's why it's a type 3, because you can see again, resistance, action force is right there. And then that's the joint we're working on. Most of our joints are type or class 3 levers. So again, hopefully that made sense to you guys going through. And your book, again, will explain those as well. Some equations, again, work. So if we talk about work, it's actually force times distance. So how much force did I put in across a certain distance? Now, don't think like miles necessarily, right? But think like from, if you're doing a bench press, right? From chest back up, there, that is a distance that was traveled. How much force did I create there? Or how much force did I move through that space? That will be how much work I have done, an actual calculation of it. Power is work over time, or another way to say it is force over velocity, or force times velocity. And so we know power is fast, right? A vertical jump, a quick cut, an Olympic movement over our head or something like that. So you're creating force at to a certain distance. There's your work. And then it's over time. The faster I do it, typically the more power I create, right? So you have to play this game with work and time. Sometimes it's too heavy. You have to move slow, so it takes a long time. Or you make it a little lighter and you move it faster, and now you have a powerful movement. That's why some people can squat, 1,000 pounds, but you can't power clean 1,000 pounds because you have to move it faster in order to get it to that certain distance. So you have to lighten the load a little bit so you can move it faster. So sometimes you might be training for power, sometimes you might be training for strength, and those are going to be different because one is more focused on force and work, and one is more focused on power. And so there's different training variables there, but I just wanted you to understand that. Let's move this. Mechanical and movement efficiency. So as much as we'd like to believe it, we're not very efficient with our movements. A lot of times, most of our lost is heat. So if you just think about the efficiency of where the work goes into, it's about 25% and 75% is lost. What leads to inefficient movement? So muscle coactivation. So if you're trying to contract one muscle and then the opposite one called the antagonist also activates, then you're not going to get as an efficient movement because you have two things that are working opposite of each other. Jerky movements. If you've never done the movement before and your body's trying to figure it out, right, that's going to lead to some ineffective movement. If you think about a squat you haven't done in 10 years or something like that. Excessive movement. If you move too much, right? If you think about running, that's usually a good example. If you run, most of the time we're told straight arms, but if you start swinging out to the side, right, there's excessive movement in these opposite directions. And now we're using energy to go left and right when all I wanted to do was go forward. Isometric actions. So if there's no movement, and sometimes those are good for training, but if there's no movement, then that would be inefficient because you're not moving anywhere. Think of it like an unstoppable force meeting an impenetrable object. And then the excessive center of gravity excursion. So center of gravity thinks you, and if you're moving all over the place, then your body's going to be moving all over the place. And that leads to some inefficient movement as well. And so what we want to do as trainers or as coaches or as whoever is eventually get people to become efficient movers. Essentially, we're trying to make them better athletes, right? Athletes are really efficient at their movements. Their bodies do what they need it to do in that moment. And so they're very fluid, right? We don't think of it as jerky. We don't, and so we want to try to reduce that. And our training can have a big impact on that and decreasing that level of inefficiency. Muscle has basically 4 characteristics. So excitability, which is a respond to a stimulus. Contractibility, generate pulling force, so able to contract. Extensibility, it is able to lengthen or stretch. And then elasticity is return to its original length and shape, right? So if I stretch a muscle out, it doesn't stay all rubbery, right? It goes back to its original shape. Or if I shorten my bicep, it doesn't stay shortened. It also elongates back to where it was, Okay. So just being aware of the characteristics of muscle is important in understanding which one defines each category. Muscle also has different architecture. It looks a little different depending on where it's at. And that also affects the amount of force that it can create and the direction of its pull. So here are some of these are the official names for it. And then we'll talk about some of the examples. So you have fusiform, you have unipennant, which just means one, bipennant is two, multipennant is multiple, and then you have radiate and longitudinal. What a pennate is just the angle from the line of pull. So if we look at these over here on the left, you have radiate here. So you can kind of see it has a center point and then it like rays out, right? So there's this big radius. So if you think about your shoulder muscle, if you've ever seen a picture of it, right? There's a single point and then it radiates across the shoulder. Then you have longitudinal. So you look at think about your glutes. You can even think about your rectus abdominis, your abs, right? Just straight up and down, longitudinal, going long. Fusiform is almost like an in and then an out. So it starts skinny, kind of bulges, and then goes back into that thinness. So there's your fusiform. Think bicep, right? You got your connective up here, connective down here, and then you have that fusiform type in the middle. Multipennant is going to be probably something like either your chest muscle, okay? And then you have your bipennant. So bi just means two. It almost looks like a feather if you look at that picture, right? So it's got two different kind of lines of pull there. So your rectus femoris, which is the big muscle in the middle of your quad. And then you have unipennant, which is going to be down here. And again, just think single angle from a single point going forward. So again, all in one direction, or line of pull, excuse me. And so again, just some different architectures, and those are going to cause different types of pull, right? If you think about your chest versus your bicep, right? They have different movement qualities to them. What these next couple slides are they are addressing different muscle actions and then the muscles that do that. Now, again, this might be more in depth than what you need to know, but for the exam, but as a trainer, right? If someone goes, I want to get, big biceps, or I want to get a bigger butt, I want to build that glute muscle, right? You have to understand what the muscles do in order to determine what exercises would be best for those muscles. Does that kind of make sense? And so, this first one, we're looking at the hip joint, right? The knee joint, and then the ankle joint. And all of these movements, extension, flexion, abduction, lateral rotation, you'll see these in the exercise section, but think extension, think hip going backwards, flexion, hip coming forward like a kick, abduction is away from you, so out to the side, and then lateral rotation is going to be a rotational component. Then you have adduction, which is bringing the legs closer together, and then you have medial rotation. Again, that's going to be working to the inside. So you have lateral, external rotation, and internal rotation. And so you can see the muscles that specifically do that, and your book's going to have these muscles. And so knowing where these are, right, and building those is important. And so just having a basic understanding of anatomy is going to be important. You have your knee joint, right, and the movements it can do. You have the ankle joint. You also have your shoulder. So your shoulder, what does it do? It can elevate, it can depress, it can retract, and it can protract. And those are going to have different muscles involved in those things. You also have your shoulder flexion, your shoulder extension behind you. You have adduction towards the middle and abduction away from you. Okay. And internal, external rotation as well. Then you have your elbow joint. Usually we go flexion, extension. Then you have your wrist. Again, you have flexion and extension. You also have some rotation there as well. So again, just understanding where your muscles are. And a lot of the muscles do similar things, or they have different motions, or it just depends on what placement your body's in to determine that movement. And even your vertebrae, right? Your spine, it's meant to move and flex and extend and rotate and bend to the side and things like that. And so again, just understanding, just realize kind of what your role is as a trainer eventually, or as a coach or anything like that, needing to understand the anatomy of the body as best you can. And that's the end. So that's chapter 4. Your books are going to go probably even into more detail. I encourage you and I want you to read these chapters. So please do that. And yeah, we're going to keep moving on, and I'll see you guys soon.